If someone had told me 10 years ago that my own family would one day throw me out of the house I paid for, I would have laughed in their face. Not because my family was perfect. Far from it. We argued. We disagreed. We held grudges longer than we should have. But family was family. At least that's what I believed. I was 47 years old when everything fell apart. 47. Divorced. No children. Working 2 jobs. And somehow still carrying the financial burden of people who never appreciated me. Looking back now, I should have seen the warning signs. That love has a funny way of blinding you. Especially when it's family. My name is Sheila Johnson. And this is the story of how I became homeless, because of the very people I spent years helping. It started after my father died. Dad was the glue that held everyone together. When he passed away from a sudden stroke, our family wasn't just grieving. We were lost. My mother, Gloria, took it the hardest. She had been married to him for 42 years. One day he was sitting in his favorite chair watching television. The next day he was gone. The house felt empty after that. Quiet, cold, like the walls themselves were mourning. At first I tried to help. Then helping became responsibility. And responsibility became expectation. My younger brother, Marcus, was 38 at the time. He had never really settled down. He jumped from one job to another. One girlfriend to another. One excuse to another. My younger sister, Denise, wasn't much different. She worked part-time when she felt like it and spent the rest of her time blaming everyone else for her problems. After Dad died, Mom's finances became a mess. The mortgage payments were behind. Property taxes were overdue. Bills were piling up. One evening, Mom called me crying. I don't know what I'm going to do. I drove over immediately. When I arrived, I found her sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by unpaid bills. She looked exhausted. Older, smaller somehow. I sat beside her. Let's figure it out. She handed me the papers. I spent nearly 3 hours going through everything. The situation was worse than I expected. Much worse. Dad had handled most of the finances. And apparently he had been quietly struggling. The house was months away from foreclosure. I remember staring at those numbers while my mother cried into a tissue. Something inside me broke. I couldn't let her lose the family home. Not the house where we grew up. Not the place filled with memories. So I made the biggest mistake of my life. I stepped in. I'll handle it. Mum looked up. What? I'll pay the arrears. Sheila, that's too much money. I know. You don't have to do that. But I did. Or at least I thought I did. Over the next few weeks, I emptied a large portion of my savings. Money I had spent years building. Money meant for retirement. Money meant for emergencies. Gone. Just like that. I saved the house. Everyone praised me. For a while. Marcus called me a hero. Denise cried and hugged me. Mum told everyone at church what a wonderful daughter she had. For a few months I felt appreciated. Then something changed. The gratitude disappeared. The payments didn't. Every month there was another expense. Another emergency. Another reason why nobody else could contribute. Marcus lost a job. Denise couldn't afford her share. Mom's medication costs increased. Guess who covered the difference? Me. Every single time. Year after year. The pattern continued. I worked overtime. I skipped vacations. I postponed retirement plans. Meanwhile, everyone else lived their lives. And every month I paid the rent. At first it was temporary. Then it became permanent. 5 years passed. Then 6. Then 7. By then, I was paying almost everything connected to that house. Rent, utilities, repairs, insurance, property taxes, everything. Sometimes I joked that I was the landlord. Nobody laughed, because deep down, everyone knew it was true. Still, I never complained. Mom was getting older. Marcus was struggling. Denise always seemed one disaster away from collapse. I convinced myself family needed me. I convinced myself sacrifice was love. I convinced myself they would do the same for me. I was wrong. Very wrong. The first crack appeared during Mom's 70th birthday. The entire family gathered at the house. Cousins, aunts, uncles, family friends. The living room was packed. At one point, my Aunt Patricia stood up to give a speech. She praised Mom, talked about her strength, her resilience, her kindness. Then she said something strange. This house remains standing because Gloria kept this family together. Everyone applauded. I smiled politely. But something bothered me, because that wasn't true. Mom hadn't paid a bill in years. I had. Again, I kept quiet. Then Marcus stood up. He raised his glass. To Mum, who sacrificed everything to keep this house in the family. More applause. More cheers. My smile started to fade. I looked around the room. Nobody corrected him. Nobody mentioned the truth. Not one person. It was as if my contributions didn't exist. As if I was invisible. That night I drove home feeling strangely empty. Not angry. Just forgotten. The feeling stayed with me. Months later, things became worse. One afternoon I arrived at the house unexpectedly. I had come to drop off groceries. As I approached the front door, I heard voices inside. Marcus, Denise, and Mom. They were talking. Arguing, actually. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But then I heard my name. And I froze. Sheila thinks she owns this place, Marcus said. My heart skipped. Denise laughed. Well, she acts like it. I mean, she helps with bills and suddenly she's queen of the house. Mom didn't say anything. That hurt most of all. Then Marcus continued. One day she's going to expect us to hand over the house. More laughter. I stood there holding grocery bags. Unable to move. Unable to breathe. Was that really how they saw me? After everything. I quietly left. I didn't knock. I didn't go inside. I drove away. For the first time in years I cried. Not because of the money. Not because of the house. Because I realized they had rewritten the story. In their version, I wasn't the person keeping them afloat. I was the villain. The controlling sister. The selfish daughter. The woman who expected recognition. And somehow, in their minds, that made me the bad guy. I should have walked away then. I should have stopped paying. I should have protected myself. But I didn't, because Mum called later that evening. And she sounded tired. Old. Fragile. So I kept helping. Another year passed. Then another. Until one ordinary Tuesday changed everything. I had just finished a 12-hour shift when my phone rang. It was Denise. Her voice sounded strange. Cold. Almost nervous. Mom wants to see you. Is everything okay? Just come over. That's all she said. Just come over. I drove to the house. The same house I had spent years paying for. The same house I believed would always be my home too. I had no idea that before the sun set that evening, my entire life would be turned upside down. And I certainly didn't know that when I reached the front door. My key would no longer work. I stood there staring at the front door, confused. I inserted my key again. Turned it. Nothing. I pulled it out and tried once more. Still nothing. For a moment I wondered if I was simply exhausted from work. Maybe I was using the wrong key. Maybe the lock was jammed. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Then I looked closer. The lock wasn't the same one. My stomach dropped. Someone had changed it. I stood there frozen. A cold feeling spread through my chest. I had paid for that front door. Paid for the lock that used to be there. Paid for the repairs after Marcus accidentally damaged it years earlier. And now I couldn't get inside. I knocked. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. Yet I could hear movement. Footsteps. Whispers. People were inside. Ignoring me. I felt my pulse racing. Then finally the door opened. Only a few inches. Denise stood there. She didn't smile. She didn't greet me. She just stared. And something in her eyes made me nervous. What happened to the lock? I asked. It's been changed. I can see that. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then I asked the obvious question. Why wasn't I given a key? She looked away. Mum made the decision. A strange ringing filled my ears. What decision? Come inside. For the first time in nearly 10 years, someone had to let me into a house I practically financed. The irony wasn't lost on me. As soon as I stepped into the living room, I knew something was wrong. Mum was sitting in her usual chair. Marcus was on the couch. Neither looked happy to see me. The atmosphere felt heavy. Like everyone had rehearsed a conversation I hadn't been invited to. I sat down slowly. What's going on? Nobody answered immediately. Mum kept twisting a tissue in her hands. Marcus stared at the television even though it wasn't on. Finally, Denise spoke. We need to talk about the house. The house. Of course. Everything always came back to the house. I looked at Mum. What about it? Mum cleared her throat. Her voice sounded shaky. Things need to change. I frowned. What does that mean? She glanced at Marcus. Then Denise. As if seeking permission. That was the first moment I realized this wasn't her idea. Not entirely. Someone had been talking to her. Influencing her. And I already knew who. Marcus. He had always been good at planting seeds and letting others believe they grew naturally. Mum finally looked at me. You've been making people uncomfortable. I blinked. What? The words didn't even make sense. By reminding everyone that you pay the bills. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it was ridiculous. When have I done that? Silence. Nobody answered. Because they couldn't. I rarely mentioned money. In fact, I spent years avoiding the subject. Yet somehow I had become the villain again. Marcus leaned forward. You act like we're all dependent on you. My jaw tightened. Because you are. The room went silent. I hadn't meant to say it. But it was true. And everyone knew it. For a brief second, guilt flashed across Marcus's face. Then it vanished. You see? He said. There it is. There what is? That attitude. I stared at him. The man hadn't paid a meaningful household bill in years. Yet somehow he was lecturing me. I looked at Denise. She quickly avoided eye contact. Then I looked at Mom. Surely she knew how absurd this was. Surely she remembered who had saved the house. Surely she remembered all the times I paid when nobody else could. Surely, we think it would be best if you step back. The words came from Mum, softly, almost apologetically, but they hit me like a slap. What does that mean? Mum swallowed hard. We don't want you involved in family decisions anymore. I laughed again. A bitter laugh. Family decisions? Nobody spoke. Then suddenly everything clicked. The changed locks. The tension. The rehearsed conversation. The avoidance. There was something else. Something they weren't telling me. And I could feel it. What's really going on? Silence. Again. Then Marcus finally said it. We're putting the house in my name. For a moment I thought I had misheard. The words were so outrageous my brain refused to process them. What? Mum lowered her eyes. The paperwork has already started. I stared at her. Then at him. Then back at her. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear myself think. You're transferring the house to Marcus. Nobody answered. Because they didn't have to. Their silence confirmed everything. I felt physically sick. The room seemed smaller, hotter, harder to breathe in. I looked at Marcus. The same man who couldn't keep a job for more than a year. The same man whose financial plan consisted of borrowing money and hoping problems disappeared. And they were giving him the house. The house I had spent years keeping alive. Tell me this is a joke. Nobody laughed. Tell me. Mum's eyes filled with tears. It's not like that. Then explain it. She couldn't, because there was no explanation that made sense. Only excuses. And excuses were exactly what came next. Marcus said he needed stability. Denise said Mom wanted the property to stay in the family. Mum said she didn't want conflict after she was gone. Every explanation sounded worse than the last. Finally, I asked the question nobody wanted to answer. What happens to all the money I've spent? Silence. I already knew the answer before anyone spoke. Still, I needed to hear it. Needed to know just how far this betrayal went. Marcus shrugged. It was your choice. I felt something inside me crack. Not break. Crack, a deep fracture that would never fully heal. My choice? Nobody forced you. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. For years they had called me whenever there was a crisis, whenever bills were overdue, whenever repairs were needed, whenever someone was short on money. Now suddenly it had all been voluntary. Convenient. Very convenient. I looked at Mum, waiting, begging silently for her to correct him, to defend me, to acknowledge reality. Instead, she whispered the words that changed everything. Marcus is right. The room went completely still. I couldn't even feel my hands anymore. Only numbness. A cold, terrible numbness. The woman I had spent a decade helping had just erased 10 years of sacrifice with a single sentence. Marcus is right. Not Sheila is right. Not thank you. Not we appreciate what you've done. Marcus is right. That was the moment I understood. This meeting wasn't a discussion. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an announcement. The decision had already been made. The locks had already been changed. The paperwork had already started. My role in the family had already ended. They simply wanted me informed. And maybe, deep down, they expected me to continue paying anyway. Because that's what I always did. I solved problems. I absorbed pain. I carried burdens. And they had become accustomed to it. But something had changed inside me. Something permanent. I stood up slowly. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody apologized. Nobody thanked me. I looked around the room. At the furniture I had helped buy. At the walls I had helped repair. At the home I had spent years protecting. Then I looked directly at Marcus. For years, I said quietly, I thought I was saving this family. He smirked. Big mistake. The smirk told me everything. It told me he believed he had won. That I would walk away quietly. That there would be no consequences. That I was still the same Sheila. The dependable Sheila. The forgiving Sheila. The Sheila who always came back. He had no idea what was coming. And neither did I, because before that week was over, I would discover a secret hidden inside that house. A secret my father had taken to his grave. A secret that would change everything they thought they knew. And when the truth finally came out, the people who threw me away would wish they hadn't. I didn't cry when I left the house. Not immediately. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before. I pulled into an empty supermarket parking lot. Then I sat there, alone, staring through the windshield. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. People walked past carrying groceries. Children laughed. Cars came and went. Life continued as if my world hadn't just collapsed. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. Then the tears came. Not delicate tears. Not movie tears. The kind that leave your chest aching. The kind that make breathing difficult. 10 years. 10 years of sacrifice. 10 years of overtime shifts. 10 years of cancelled vacations. 10 years of putting everyone else's needs before my own. And apparently none of it mattered. I wasn't family anymore. I was an inconvenience. A wallet they no longer needed. By the time I got home, I felt completely drained. I ignored my phone. Ignored messages. Ignored everything. For 3 days, I barely spoke to anyone. I went to work. Came home. Slept. Repeated the cycle. But the anger kept growing. Not loud anger. Quiet anger. The dangerous kind. The kind that sits silently and starts connecting pieces you previously ignored. And the more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Something didn't make sense. If Mom wanted Marcus to have the house, fine. It hurt, but it was her decision. Except, was it really? The house wasn't originally hers. It had belonged to both my parents. Dad had always handled the paperwork. Dad had always handled the finances. Dad had always been meticulous about legal matters. He wasn't the type of man who left loose ends. The thought lingered in my mind. Then one Saturday morning, something happened. I was cleaning out an old storage closet, mostly because I needed a distraction. Inside were dozens of boxes I hadn't opened since my divorce. Old photographs, tax returns, family albums, random paperwork. Hours passed. Then I found a small metal box. My father's handwriting was on the lid. Sheila. My heart stopped. I sat down immediately. Dad had died nearly 8 years earlier. Seeing his handwriting felt like hearing his voice again. The box was locked, but taped underneath was a small key. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were several documents. Old photographs, a few letters, and one sealed envelope. Across the front, written in Dad's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 words. For Sheila, if necessary. I stared at it. My pulse quickened. The envelope looked old. Very old. Years old. Slowly I opened it. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellowing slightly with age. I immediately recognized the date. Dad had written it less than 6 months before he died. I began reading. And within 30 seconds my entire body went cold. Dad knew. He had known. Even back then. Known what? That Marcus couldn't be trusted with money. That Denise avoided responsibility. That I would eventually become the family's caretaker. Every concern he wrote about had become reality. That then I reached the paragraph that changed everything. If anything ever happens to me, the documents regarding the house are enclosed. I have made arrangements to ensure fairness. Sheila has sacrificed more than anyone realizes. She must never be left vulnerable. I stopped breathing. The documents regarding the house. My eyes snapped to the bottom of the box. There were more papers underneath. Lots of them. Property records. Legal documents. Bank records. I spread them across my dining table. Then I started reading. 1 page. Then another. Then another. By midnight, I felt physically ill. Because the story I had been told for years wasn't true. Not even close. The house hadn't been saved by my mother after Dad's death. Dad had already prepared for everything. Years earlier. Including legal protections. Including ownership arrangements. Including provisions specifically connected to me. I spent the entire weekend reviewing documents. Cross-checking dates. Reading every page carefully. By Sunday evening, one fact was undeniable. The house wasn't supposed to pass entirely to Mum, and it certainly wasn't supposed to be transferred solely to Marcus. There were conditions. Legal conditions. Conditions nobody had ever mentioned. Conditions I had never known existed. Why? Because nobody told me. The realization hit me like a train. Mum knew. Or at least she had known once. Maybe she'd forgotten. Maybe she'd been pressured. Maybe she'd ignored it. I didn't know. But someone had hidden the truth. Monday morning, I called the attorney whose name appeared repeatedly in the documents. I expected voicemail. Maybe a retired office. Maybe nothing at all. Instead, a receptionist answered. And to my surprise, the firm still existed. I scheduled an appointment immediately. 2 days later, I sat across from a lawyer named Rebecca Turner. She reviewed the paperwork quietly, occasionally adjusting her glasses, occasionally making notes. After nearly an hour, she looked up. "Where did you find these?" "My father's documents." She nodded slowly. Interesting. Not exactly reassuring. "What does that mean?" She folded her hands. "It means your father was extremely thorough." My pulse quickened. "Can you explain?" She studied me carefully. Then she said something that made my stomach flip. "The current transfer should not be happening this way." For several seconds I couldn't speak. "What?" "The documents suggest your father's estate included provisions protecting your financial interests." I stared at her, trying to process every word. "Protecting me?" "Yes." The room felt smaller. Suddenly I remembered all those years, all those payments, all those sacrifices, all those times I was treated like an outsider. Had they known? Had they known the entire time? Rebecca continued reviewing paperwork. The deeper she looked, the more concerned she became. Finally, she closed the folder. "Mrs. Johnson, I strongly recommend you do not discuss this with your family yet." "Why?" "Because there appear to be serious discrepancies." The word discrepancies sounded terrifying. "What kind?" She hesitated, then chose her words carefully. "The kind that could create significant legal problems." A chill ran down my spine. I immediately thought of Marcus, his confidence, his smirk, his certainty, the certainty of someone who believed victory was guaranteed. What if he wasn't confident because he was right? What if he was confident because he assumed I didn't know the truth? The possibility made my heart race. For the first time since being locked out, I felt something new. Not grief, not anger, hope, tiny, fragile, but real. I drove home feeling different. The pain was still there. The betrayal was still there. But now there were questions. Questions my family wouldn't want answered. That evening my phone rang. "Mum." For a moment I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. "Hello?" Silence. Then her voice. "We need to talk." I almost laughed. Now they wanted to talk. After changing locks. After excluding me. After giving away the house. Interesting timing. "What about?" Another pause. Then she said something that made every hair on my arms stand up. "Marcus found some old papers." My grip tightened around the phone. "What papers?" Silence. Then her voice trembled. "The same papers you've been looking at." My heart nearly stopped. How did they know? Who told them? And more importantly, why were they suddenly afraid? Because for the first time in years, the balance of power had shifted. And somewhere inside that house was a truth nobody wanted exposed. A truth my father had carefully protected. A truth that could destroy everything Marcus thought he had won. The moment Mom said Marcus had found the same papers, I knew one thing. They were scared. For the first time since they changed the locks, they were scared. Not angry. Not defensive. Scared. And people only become scared when they realize they may lose something. The next morning, I met with attorney Rebecca Turner again. This time, she had completed a full review of my father's documents. The folder she placed on the desk looked thicker than before. My stomach twisted. I wasn't sure whether I wanted good news or bad news. At least bad news would be simple. The truth turned out to be far more complicated. Rebecca opened the file. "Your father anticipated this." I blinked. "What?" "He anticipated family conflict after his death." I stared at her. That sounded exactly like Dad. He loved us all. But he understood us. Maybe better than we understood ourselves. Rebecca slid several documents across the desk. "Your father amended ownership arrangements years before he died." I looked down. My hands began shaking. There it was. His signature. His handwriting. His instructions. Everything legal. Everything valid. Everything documented. And then Rebecca delivered the sentence that changed everything. The house cannot legally be transferred solely to Marcus. For several seconds I couldn't speak. All the hurt. All the sleepless nights. All the betrayal. Everything froze. What do you mean? She pointed to a specific section. Your father created a protective agreement. I read it twice. Then 3 times. Because my brain struggled to accept what I was seeing. Dad had included me. Not as an afterthought. Not as a backup plan. As an equal protected beneficiary. The house was never supposed to belong entirely to one person. Not Mum, not Marcus, not Denise. It was supposed to be handled according to conditions designed to protect the family fairly, including me, especially me. Rebecca looked directly at me. If you've been contributing financially to the property for years, that strengthens your position considerably. I closed my eyes. For 10 years I had believed nobody saw my sacrifices. Apparently one person had. Dad, even after death. Dad had seen everything. And somehow, he had tried to protect me. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the house. Because for the first time in years I felt seen. The following weekend, we had a family meeting. This time I wasn't alone. Rebecca sat beside me. When Marcus walked into the room and saw her, the colour immediately drained from his face. Good. Let him feel uncomfortable. I had felt uncomfortable for years. Mom looked nervous. Denise looked confused. Marcus looked terrified. That told me everything. Rebecca began calmly, professionally, methodically. For nearly an hour, she explained the documents, the ownership provisions, the estate arrangements, the legal responsibilities, the restrictions, every fact, every signature, every clause, every truth. The room grew quieter and quieter. By the end, nobody had anything left to say, because facts don't care about feelings. And the facts were devastating. The transfer they had started wasn't valid. The house wasn't theirs to hand over. Not the way they intended. Not legally. Not morally. Not according to Dad's wishes. Marcus finally exploded. This isn't fair. I almost laughed. Fair. Now he wanted fairness. The same man who had watched me pay bills for a decade. The same man who changed the locks. The same man who sat quietly while I was pushed out. Now he wanted fairness. Rebecca calmly asked him a question. How much have you contributed toward the property over the last 10 years? Silence. Absolute silence. Because everyone in that room knew the answer. Very little. Then she turned to me. How much have you contributed? I handed over records. Years of records. Receipts. Transfers. Invoices. Tax payments. Repair costs. Utility bills. Everything. The stack was nearly 3 inches thick. Mom started crying. Not dramatic crying. The heartbreaking kind. The kind that comes when reality finally catches up with you. She looked at those records. Every payment. Every sacrifice. Every act of love. And for the first time, she truly saw it. Saw what I had given. Saw what she had allowed. Saw what had been taken for granted. Then she looked at me, and something in her face broke. Sheila, her voice cracked. I hadn't heard that tone in years. The tone of a mother. Not a homeowner. Not a person choosing sides. A mother. I'm sorry. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because everyone knew those words were long overdue. Mum cried harder. I was wrong. The room remained silent. I let people influence me. Her eyes drifted toward Marcus. He lowered his head. I convinced myself that because you were strong, you didn't need protecting. I felt tears forming, because so many women understand that feeling. The responsible daughter, the dependable sister, the one who always manages, the one who never complains. People stop seeing her sacrifices because they assume she always survive. Meanwhile, everyone rushes to rescue the people creating the problems. Mum looked directly at me, and I forgot who was carrying us. That hurt, because it was true. But strangely, it also healed something. For years I had wanted acknowledgement. Not money, not ownership, acknowledgement. And finally I received it. Then something happened nobody expected. Marcus stood up. For a moment I thought he was about to argue again. Instead he looked at me, really looked at me. And for the first time in years I saw shame. Real shame. Not embarrassment. Not frustration. Shame. I owe you an apology. I nearly fell out of my chair. Marcus apologizing was rarer than a solar eclipse. Yet there he was, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. You helped all of us, he swallowed hard. And I resented you for it. Nobody interrupted. I felt like a failure, his voice cracked. So I convinced myself you thought you were better than us. I sat quietly, listening. For once. Not fixing. Not rescuing. Just listening. That wasn't your fault. His eyes filled with tears. It was mine. The room went silent again. Years of resentment. Years of jealousy. Years of assumptions. All finally laid bare. The truth wasn't that they hated me. The truth was sadder. They had become dependent on me. And dependency often turns into resentment. People begin to hate the person reminding them of what they aren't doing. I didn't excuse their behavior, but I finally understood it. And understanding is powerful. A month later, the legal situation was resolved. According to Dad's wishes. Properly. Fairly. No tricks. No secrets. No manipulation. The house remained in the family, but under terms that respected everyone's rights, including mine. Most importantly, I stopped paying everyone's bills. That chapter ended forever. Not out of revenge. Out of self-respect. Marcus got a full-time job. A real one. The first stable job he'd held in years. Denise finally became financially independent. And Mum learned something difficult. Love and guilt are not the same thing. You can love someone without sacrificing yourself for them. As for me, I bought a small house 18 months later. Nothing extravagant. Nothing fancy. Just mine. The first evening there, I sat alone on the porch with a cup of tea. The sun was setting. Birds were singing. And for the first time in years, nobody needed anything from me. No emergency. No overdue bill. No crisis. Just peace. I remember looking at the sky and thinking about Dad, about the box, about the letter, about everything. Then I smiled, because in the end, the greatest gift my father left wasn't the documents. It wasn't the legal protection. It wasn't the house. It was the lesson. A lesson that took me nearly 50 years to learn. If people only value you when you're sacrificing yourself for them, they never valued you properly to begin with. Real family doesn't measure your worth by what you provide. Real family appreciates what you give. And real love never asks you to disappear so everyone else can be comfortable. I lost a house. I lost illusions. I lost 10 years. But I found something far more valuable. My voice. And once I found it, nobody could lock me out again.